Right. Hello again. Is this next one? Anyway, the future. I think the session before was obviously about the present and the future and so on. And I'm going to talk a bit about the creative bureaucracy. And in one sentence, you could say it's how do you move from a no because culture to a yes if culture? And how can we also trade sometimes our power or whatever for creative influence, which means giving away power in some sort of sense. Now, there are obviously some massive big issues we all know about, but I think they very much shape the context of what we're talking about. And I remember that I heard that Overshoot Day, when do we use the one planet world, was the 23rd of September in 2000. This year, it was the 29th of July. I know there are climate deniers somewhere, but I mean, this is sort of telling us the story because that day is going down and down and down very rapidly. And that creates a series of fault lines, and this image I'm showing you is this fault line that we need to heal, and fractures, and relates to the sort of fragility and vulnerability, another word that came up today. And I think most people agree, certainly at the global level, the big organizations, UN and so on, that we're in the midst of a systemic crisis, and a business as usual approach will simply not get us to where we want to be and need to be. I know that's simple to say, but what we see and what I think we know is we've got an economy which is materially expansive, socially divisive largely, I know it's a pity, and environmentally hostile. So if that's a sort of bigger context which the public domain, the public interest is trying to address and solve, there's a vast challenge ahead. And add to which the world is turning to its darker face. I don't want to mention the people we don't particularly like across the world, but they're the sort of people who say, I don't like other people and so on, and make divisions between patriots and globalists and so on. So in some sense, you could say it's 1 minute towards midnight. But given we're talking about creative bureaucracy and all of that, we're very much a half glass full approach, and we're fine about all that, and we're going to do something, sort of. And you can see that in many ways. This is just a festival called We Make the City in Amsterdam. It's very, very, very big. And you can see all the words here at the opening, which are the sort of issues you're discussing: circular economies, socially smart places, obviously inclusivity and all of that. And I think we need to also address, when we're thinking about these things, and I know you're aware of it, of course, is the nomadic world that's emerging, you know, this here-there phenomenon. I'm here, where do I belong, when everything's on the move, the digital, what is the good and the bad of it, and obviously the wicked problems. And in that context, can the tried and tested work? And it was just very nice that that phrase came through everything, trial and error, trying, and so on. And obviously we know that the world is in motion. Perhaps being sustainable is a bit difficult. When I was born, there were 2.6 billion people in the world, now 7.7. All right, it's a white elephant in the room, but it is about education, addressing these issues. So the world is in motion. Cities are in motion because, of course, so many cities are growing because of that population growth and so on. And then the issue, when all of these mixes are happening, how do you create zones of encounter where we can gather together? And in many projects I've been involved in, or juries and so on, the projects that are being proposed are so often about gathering places of difference. And those gathering places could be anything. How do you create, for example, places of empathy? I'm not saying we need to love each other or anything like that, but at least to have some sort of sense that we can coexist in a reasonable way. And in other words, as we know, the world is turning into a very small place in some sense, which is obviously enabled by the massive breakthrough we all know of, which is completely immersive, and whose effects have really only just begun, which of course is the digitizing world. And one of the issues there, and this is where perhaps the slightly laid backness of Adelaide will help, there's a certain sort of hyper-vitality about this, which can make you completely fragmented, that you don't know where the hell you are, what you are, and so on. And so perhaps the relative calmness of Adelaide is the sort of mindful city. I know it's really mindlessness because it's mindful. When you're trying to be mindful, you're trying to empty your mind rather than fill it. But nevertheless, we'll talk about that later. And in all of that, of course, is big data. And again, like every technological development, there's the good and the bad. And we know, obviously, AI is potentially good. But who decides the algorithm? Well, we asked about what the algorithm would be. Who is that strange person who is creating that algorithm and so on? And also there's Mark Zuckerberg. I picked this out. This is Mark Zuckerberg being asked a couple of questions in the Senate committee, or perhaps he's being photographed. Anyway, and within all of this are a series of issues, which is here, this is just the Berlin Metro, which is saying, how do differences come together in a city? How are they managed? How do we, in this world turning to its darker face, create places of relevant, acceptance of each other? How, these are just the dilemmas you all know about, how in a world when the first time in history it's not the old teaching the young, it's more often the young teaching the old, which then, in a sense, is a vast cultural issue or adaptation. I'm looking at you, Renee, you probably could teach me a lot of things about something, I don't know what, but digitisation certainly. And then there are all these other issues we know about, and we've discussed them already in the last few days, about levels of homelessness rising all over the place, obviously drugs. These are all the problems we all know. These are the wicked problems, obesity and so on. And as you know, this is not Photoshop, this is the real Venice. And you probably remember the recent cricket matches in Delhi. They all had to do, this is what they looked like as they were playing against Bangladesh. And then there's the issue, of course, of the 1%, 99%. So all of that you know, and there's not much to say, except that, can we address them in the traditional way? So social cleansing of Soho is just really about the fact that as places develop, they gentrify, obviously. There's a renaissance happening, and this interesting picture, for me at least, was taken in, I took it in Zurich, where one artist who still had the old building said, resistance, in the same typeface. So urban development is essentially about renaissance and resistance, but obviously in order to overcome the resistance, the sort of collaborative and participative imperative is a key issue. So when we look at things like creativity, there was a creativity which was really important perhaps in the early 80s, which was very much cultural artistic creativity. It's still important, but clearly, given the issues I just raised, the focus will change and has to change. Just as cities have changed, there was very much the hardware-driven city, 30 years ago, everything is about physical infrastructure. Then you could call that city 1.0. 2.0 might be being more aware of needing to consult and co-create and things like that. And the 3.0 city is very much the one where we shape, make, and I suppose really co-design the city. And that shapes what that city looks and feels like. And how that feels like, obviously, creates the conditions within which prosperity, growth, wealth, and all of these other things can occur. And the great rethinking over the last 30 years, and I'm simplifying, of course, has first been phase one, you could say, let's make the physical urban infrastructure more attractive. Let's then, Doha Khan. Is Doha Khan there? That's great. Hi, Doha. Shall I go back, or shall I just ad-lib? I'll ad-lib. Or can you recreate where I'm at? No? You can't recreate where I'm at? Oh, you're shaking your head? Ah, all right. I'll slow down. Are you going to try and recreate? You can't. It's crashed. What? Oh, really? Okay, fine. So, the next phase in city making is really the one where people say the artist or someone like that needs to be involved in that. So you've got a rich cultural scene. The third is then to say we've got an interesting university structure because you've got good infrastructure and good culture, which obviously then encourage skilled people to come. And then what you've got is then on the basis of that perhaps the conditions for a startup culture. But the big issue that practically every city in Europe is addressing is the question of how do we think beyond ourselves? How do we live in a planet-conscious world? And that then sets up the question of the creative bureaucracy. And the creative bureaucracy, nobody's saying is the bureaucracy is everything, but what we do know is most things can't happen without a bureaucracy. And although these two words seem to be in tension, the message of this idea is to say, you too have potential. Of course you've got potential. You joined this entity because you wanted to make choices about working in the common good and the public interest and so on. So that's sort of the biggest frame. The next thing is, what are these pillars? What are the elements that make that potentially work? And one pillar clearly is, how do you rethink the regulations and incentives regime for the 21st century? Secondly, and here when we wrote this book, Margie was really absolutely crucial, Margie Korst, in really thinking through the inner life of these institutions and what that potential is. And those who've lived that experience know that they often want to give more. And the third thing about the creative bureaucracy is this notion of having a completely new relationship with the outside world, whether it's the civic sector or the business sector or whichever entity that is. And the interesting question it poses, this idea, is saying, I know that some people are very happy with the stability and the rules and the security and all of that, and that's why I've joined this institution. But it also challenges them to say, are you filling all the opportunities? Are you exploring everything? Are you really connecting with others? Are you willing to share your budgets with others? When it gets down to the nitty-gritty, many people say, yeah, I'm willing to be collaborative, and then it comes to the budget session and say, will you give me a bit of your education budget, and then we'll put it in a third budget and so on. I was nearly going to say the shit hits the fan, but I didn't want to say that. But that's when it really gets tense, when that point happens. So the question is, although this is trying to actually be a positive thing, we have to be aware that there's still a long way to go. And the questions, I suppose, we have to ask ourselves are manifold. There is the wicked problems, there's all of these things, but there is a question of what the big next issues are. There is, when we take a helicopter view, there are lots of initiatives, and I prefigured to some extent some of these questions by saying, are we getting enough critical mass? Are we able to scale up? And are we embedding? And the shift that I think that we're moving towards, and again it's so easy to say, is from a predict and provide model of thinking through how the world works. 1 kilometre of road, $1 million or whatever, and in 2 months or 2 years or whatever, to one where we have to be strategically principled and tactically flexible. And those strategic principles, I think, need to revalue that which hey, this is amazing. What's happening here, guys? Do you mind if I just flick through? Ah, great. Do you mind if I just go back? I was just ad-libbing there in a minute. Is that okay? Because one of the things I'm thinking about is also the opportunities, because this slide is just useful for that. In Europe, there are 260 million cars. Do you know how much gold is in those cars which is not used? 440 tons of gold is in those cars. Current value, 12 billion euros. There are things like, so these cars which are basically just chucked, there's that much gold in it, 400 tons. There are new ideas which are often coming from the public sector, like these algae farms in the Netherlands that are eating pollution along the side of the road. Or there is this bike, a Swedish bike, made out of Nespresso caps and stuff like that. So when you think about all the things as we move from, let's say, a linear economy to a recycling economy to a circular economy, you suddenly see there are vast potentials for innovation. And what I think is interesting there is the sort of thinking that Splash had, that experimental thinking, is precisely the sort of things we could try out. I'm just using this as just one example, given that, of course, I don't need to remind you that cars are only used something like 9% of the time. So the issue is the central dilemma. I've mentioned it, the decline of the public good. The market on its own cannot solve the problem. You know something, I think I'll stop. Or shall I stop? What's the time? It's 12 o'clock. Should I stop? Are we late? Yes. Are we late? Or do you want another 5 minutes? 5 minutes. Okay, sorry, I know, because there's a bit of fraction, because this suddenly Dona Khan came into the picture, which is fine. Anyway, so as I said, the bureaucracy is not everything, but you can't do anything without a bureaucracy. Obviously, the words are in tension, and that we have to recapture the positive values. The other point is important, is about these aims, revaluing the public interest as a vocation, shifting the image of what a bureaucracy can be, attracting the young to reshape the bureaucracy. There are so many young people who choose to work in other sectors but don't work in the bureaucracy because they have a sense that it's not, well, it has an image that is not really what they want. The question of the pillars, which I already discussed, which is the inner life, the incentives, and creating new forms of trust. And then, of course, it's really about what are we aiming for? What are the goals? And the goals are obviously to address global issues that really matter, turning urgent policies into reality, so it's not just a report, and helping to create, obviously, fairer, more livable places. And the argument has always been, roughly, that the public bureaucracy can't do this. I feel that we see there are many solutions they're beginning to create. So it is an argument as a sort of clarion call to fresh thinking and unleashing the talent that we know we have in public institutions, and really not letting the rules shape the vision, but the vision to shape the rules, which means reassessing policies and things like that. And then moving away from that thinking that the state is by definition inefficient to the issues that's already been raised today about Matsukatu, that many of the things that we rely on actually came initially from state investment in some form or another. And the capturing the potential, I don't need to repeat that, that's all about the people positively going into this domain, and also trying to actually not reduce their potential as they work in structures that might be a bit too rigid. And the capturing the potential point really is what I've already said, that there are many people completely happy, but then challenging oneself to say that could we do more? Could we connect better to the outside world? Can we trust other partners? Do we have to do it ourselves? And I suppose all I would like to then just remind you, just very briefly, is when we're looking at various forms of creativity, we need to distinguish between the individual. We recognize often an individual who's imaginative, they're quite open-minded, they're exploratory, they're hopefully lively and all of that. But that's very different when you get into the organization, because the organizational creativity requires all this thing about teamwork that was addressed already by Matthew. You addressed it yesterday, Dan, about the team, how the different skills coalesce. And it's not then all these people are necessarily woo like this. It's lots of people who are a bit more nitty-gritty as well. And it's this balance between the nitty-gritty folks and the others who have mutual respect that is key. And then we ask ourselves the system, and the system, of course, then adds another level of complexity, because you've got these different organizational cultures, and how do they fit together? We had an interesting session yesterday about all the agencies in SA, and there were more than I ever thought, by the way, in passing. But anyway, how do those all marry each other? And then how does that express itself in the city? How can we see in the city, and this is what I think is really important, I think we need to see in the city the elements of imagination that is embodied in these invisible systems that seem so unglamorous. And one of the major challenges for city makers is to make the invisible visible somehow. And often the arts could help, or other things could help, or the History Trust could help, or anyone can help. And finally, obviously, about the state. And I suppose the future bureaucrat is obviously more open than closed. They seem to understand, they've got a mindset where they know when you've got to be a bit open, but they also know when you've got to gather in together. So it's not about being open and, you know, for 24/7. The second thing is they seem to be able to want to work in an integrated way, which means that I think they have to be able to lift themselves up and see, or try to see, the essence of the problem, and then drill down later. And of course, that capacity to be foresight focused. And I think emotions has appeared very often in the last 3 days, is this emotional intelligence, which I don't need to elaborate on, obviously the capacity to listen and so on. And in terms of skills, and this is a difficult balance often when someone's trained in a specific skill, the capacity to have more general skills and linking them to the specific skills. And obviously, we've already said, you can't deal with complicated things necessarily on your own. And the final slide I'll just show before I stop then, therefore, is really, there are different types of creativity. You don't expect South Australia or Adelaide to reinvent everything. The key thing about the creativity idea is you're willing to reassess and stand back and say, is it okay? And some things are okay and they are left, but at least one's open enough to say they could change. Then you may imitate something that someone else has done, and that's absolutely fine if they're doing it better than you. You may adapt what they have done, which is also fine. And the key issue I think we're trying to do in our program is to really assess in South Australia and Adelaide which types of elements one needs to push. Does one need more imitation? Does one need more mixing elements? The splash example is a great example. It was more a cultural thing. What happens if splash goes into sustainability as an idea? What happens if splash goes into some other sector, economic development? And then, of course, there's this thing about, do we need to translate something? And this is where we're saying, do we need more disruptive levels of innovation and so on? And finally, once in a lifetime, I was just thinking, have I ever had an original idea? And I think I've only had 1.5 in my life. So very rarely does one have a really interesting, new, original idea that nobody else has ever had. So that's it for me now. Thank you very much.